Right. How are you all? That's it. Who was in the crisis session? Yes. That's it. Now we're going to fast forward. I'm going to give you some more headaches. Here you go. Right, so my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute. So we're a futures and deep futures advisory organization, typically working up to 50 years out. So I track over 600 emerging technologies, hundreds of trends, and we try to bring all of these together to figure out, so what? What's their impact? That's it. And during the crisis session, we were talking about cyber and malware. I will give you a headache around that. So, now, when we actually think about the energy industry, it's really, as we kind of discussed before, everyone takes energy, especially electricity, for granted. If we traveled back in time 300 years ago, the things that we don't realize, the things that we don't even think of as being important, you would end up, people from the medieval ages, looking at these and saying, what are these artificial suns that you have in each room? So today we're living in this kind of science fiction age where we are increasingly used to using increasingly powerful, sophisticated artificial intelligences that have IQs of anywhere between 136 to 135. So ChatGPT has the IQ of Albert Einstein. It's increasingly getting an EQ. However, the AIs that we're using today have 1,000 times more general knowledge than any human. And by 2028, they will have an IQ of 1,600 and 1 billion, with a B, times more general knowledge than any human. So today we are living in this sort of science fiction world, and we don't really realize it. We don't necessarily appreciate just exactly what we have. Even the electric scooters. If you take an electric scooter back to ancient Greek times, they would wonder what this amazing chariot was. And yet we buy them for our kids, right? So from an energy perspective, I was actually going to write that we're kind of living in this Tesla 2.0 moment, except that might actually put the wrong mood for a start, especially with what Elon Musk has actually been doing. But we're actually living in this kind of Nikola Tesla 2.0 moment. We talk about the Wright brothers and the Wright brothers inventing the first aircraft, and we're reinventing aircraft. We're reinventing not just energy, but we are reinventing how we generate it, how we transmit it, how we use it, what we use it for, what we power it with. And increasingly, the energy industry is at the heart of absolutely everything. So for example, when we have a look at the recent European blackouts, did anyone kind of pause to think, without electricity, there is no super intelligent AI? The tech bros did. Now, when we think about the future that we actually live in, we're operating at multiple speeds. This is one of the biggest problems that you have as individuals, getting your head around the future. But it's also the biggest problem that governments and companies have as well. And we have 3 kinds of speeds that we all have to run at. So firstly, we're running at digital speed. So someone releases an artificial intelligence today, and it's very powerful. But next week, they release a new AI, and it's multiple times more capable, multiple times smarter, multiple times more autonomous, multiple times more performant. And so we kind of have to keep relearning the latest technology. We see that with ChatGPT, Anthropic, Google Gemini. A new release comes out and we're like, what does this one now do? Because I only just got my head around the one from 2 years ago. Then we have physical. So the rate at which we change the physical environment is also accelerating. And I'll show you a little bit later. So for example, we're starting to 3D print buildings. But when we actually have a look at the European energy grid, as we discussed earlier, if you want to bake in the latest artificial intelligence, you can do that quite quickly. However, if you actually want to change the physical grid, then it's what, 3 to 5% every year? And so we can change the European energy grid kind of once every 50 years, when the pace of technological change is pretty much a day. And then we've got government. And government, it used to be the case that you went to speak to any kind of government, the German government, whoever it happened to be, and they would say, the problem that we have as a government is that we act really slow. We're really bureaucratic, we've got a lot of red tape, we work really slowly. And then Trump comes along, and all of a sudden, our governments are whipsawing. We're getting new tariffs every day, new regulations every day. The European Union has 350 new regulations coming through. The CBAM regulation alone basically tipped the energy industry on its head. So as individuals and as businesses, we're trying to get across all three of these. Very fast digital and technological change, medium-paced sort of physical change, and then the pace of government, which is both really slow and also really fast. Now, from a technology perspective, while everyone keeps talking about artificial intelligence, there's a reason I've put this up. This is my 311 starburst. There are 167 emerging technologies on here. Now, on the one hand, we've got different categories. So we've got 13 different categories. If you have a look at the biotech space, there's a huge amount of innovation in the biotech space. So there's a huge amount of research going on right now to help us all live longer. That's great. But look at the amount of new innovations coming through. So these are just the technologies. When you have a look at the energy space, I would actually start arguing that there is more new technology development in the energy space than in the biotech space. And we won't go through all of these, but when we have a look at things like proton batteries and quantum batteries and everything else, a quantum battery is a kind of battery that lasts forever. And we're really good at making them in the UK. We've got space-based energy systems, structural batteries. If you want to eliminate lithium-ion batteries out of an electric vehicle, like Lamborghini do, Lamborghini is making a car where the car itself, the chassis, is its own battery. So we've got a huge amount of energy innovation coming through. And then we also have a huge amount of essentially intelligence technologies coming through, so AI, ostensibly. But we're moving from narrow artificial intelligence to artificial general intelligence in 2028. As you get your head around generative AI, we see agentic artificial intelligence coming through, a whole new kind of AI. And then we get AGI. And then we've also got AIs that we've 3D printed, liquid artificial intelligences, and AIs made out of DNA. We have new materials coming through, which is important from the grid. So we keep trying to develop room temperature semiconductors because that would reduce the electrical resistance of the European energy grid. And we reckon that that would reduce the amount of energy that's lost in the European energy grid by about 90%. So there's all sorts of stuff going on. Security, I'll touch on that a little bit later. But when we look at cybersecurity, increasingly, cybersecurity is your issue. So what we do is when we have a look at how different industries are changing and how that actually affects the energy industry. As I said, increasingly, we're starting to 3D print entire buildings. We've 3D printed 3-story buildings in Germany. We're 3D printing 11-story skyscrapers in Dubai. But by 3D printing a building, you can print it using new materials. And some of the materials that we've started printing buildings with store energy. So increasingly, the skyscraper in New York or the skyscraper in Dubai is your grid-scale storage solution. When we have a look at the energy industry itself, we're still really at the start of a $92 trillion shift to renewables. Last year, we saw about 260 gigawatts of new renewable capacity coming online versus about 65 gigawatts of fossil fuels. So while in America, there is the resurgence of drill, baby, drill, the rest of the world, pretty much, other than the petrostates, and even some of the petrostates, like Saudi Arabia, for example, are going all in on renewable energy. When we have a look at electronic trading, increasingly quite a lot of the organizations that I work with, particularly on the generation side, so companies like Centrica, RWE, these kinds of guys, we're seeing autonomous brokerage systems coming through. When we have a look at factories, Volkswagen and Audi, post-Ukraine, said that they were going through what they called an existential threat. Now, if you've ever worked with the German government, and I've worked with the German government for about 10 years, you sit down with them and you say, the future looks a little bit like this. And the German government has traditionally sort of gone, yeah, interesting, like that. But a lot of the changes, a lot of the disruptions that they see don't affect Germany. Not really. The German government cares a lot about German manufacturing. So when we saw the price of gas leap 244%, when Volkswagen's giant Wolfsburg plant started becoming uneconomic, we then saw German auto manufacturers blink. Then we saw the Chinese coming in with their electric vehicles that were 30% cheaper than anything that Germany produces. And for the first time ever, the German government said, our car manufacturing industry now faces an existential threat. For the first time ever, the German government went, bugger. And we're seeing the same kind of pattern emerge in the energy industry as well, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. And then when we actually have a look at how we power transport, yes, it's still very heavy on fossil fuels, but Airbus is trying to zero in on hydrogen with their new A320 and A380 airframes. We are seeing the electrification of terrestrial transport, so cars, vans, trucks, and so on and so forth. So the entire energy mix of our entire transportation sector is changing in ways that we haven't seen really for a century. The first electric car was invented in 1912, to put it into perspective, but it's only now that we actually have the technologies and the investments that we need to really start making EVs make sense. President Trump, pretty much every world leader, but especially President Trump, has said this: cheap energy is a strategic advantage for any economy. This is a statement from Liu. He's the vice president of the State Grid Corporation of China. China is now producing renewable energy that is generating electricity at about 20 megawatts per hour, or $20 per megawatt hour. The European equivalent is about $40 per megawatt hour. But one of China's ambitions is to connect together the intercontinental energy grids. This is his statement: an intercontinental ballistic missile for the global energy market. Now, think about our Volkswagen or German EV example. If China is producing new renewable energy systems that are already at $20 per megawatt hour, bearing in mind that solar is an exponential technology, then if China can connect their grids to Europe's grids, we estimate that their cost of energy will undercut European cost of energy by about 40%. So with organizations like RWE, basically we say you need to diversify your products, you need to grow exports, because at the moment Europe's energy market is really trying to serve itself, but increasingly we should be exporting European energy to Africa, Asia. There are even talk of Europe to North American interconnected grids. But fundamentally, we need to be very, very careful that all of a sudden we don't find Chinese energy coming in from Africa, which is a whole story in itself, and the rest of Asia. Because the entire European energy market will be undercut. We see it time and time again. We see it in artificial intelligence, we see it in energy, basically we see it in manufacturing. It doesn't matter whether it's toys, basically, or whether it's aircraft. So when we have a look at some of the trends that we're now working with, we're still in a cost of living crisis. When you actually have a look at the amount of money that most people are paying for their energy, it's huge. This is causing problems. When we have a look at business models, increasingly the large generators are thinking more in terms of energy as a service, where they just provide you with energy, but they look after the rest of the vertical stack. So they will look after warehouse, they will look after generation, brokerage, retail, whatever they get up to. But they will just look after absolutely everything, and you just have to care about, are your lights on? Energy security. I work with about 50 to 60 governments around the world. There is not a single government on the planet that is not prioritizing energy security. You know, we talked about Europe's ambition for net zero earlier. Europe is trying to shore up its own energy supply, especially post-Russia or post the Ukraine war. When we have a look at ESG investment, you know, it's not a surprise, basically, that the environment has been weaponized in America. And so what we've seen is we've seen a 70% drop in large global asset managers who are investing in ESG portfolios, which includes renewable energy. So we're actually now in a position where we are seeing fewer American firms actually investing in renewable energy. We've got infrastructure resilience, which is a problem. So we have a warming world. So when I was at COP28, we started talking about a 3 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures, which on the one hand strains the grid because we see more people in Europe as well as Asia using more air conditioning. You know, last year, the amount of energy used by European air conditioners increased by about 60%. So infrastructure resilience, we talk about replacing the European energy grid, but we don't have to just replace the European energy grid. We also need to make it resilient to floods in Germany, to amazingly high temperatures in the south of Spain. When we have a look at hydro, we've seen quite a lot of European hydroelectric dams and lakes actually reach historic lows. When we think about policies, from a regulatory perspective and a policy perspective, a government perspective, one day we have one policy, the next day we've got another policy. But there are hundreds of different policies coming through. And again, we have to try to figure out what all these mean for our businesses and then be compliant. Increasingly, we're seeing consumers who are putting solar panels on their roofs, tying into microgrids, and selling energy back to the grid. So we see the rise of what we call prosumers. And then, of course, we've got sanctions. We've got the Americans and Europeans basically putting sanctions on different countries for different reasons. But we've got China that has pretty much banned the export of rare earth metals. Now, if you want to create a wind turbine, if you want to create an electric vehicle, if you want to create any kind of technology-based thing, you need rare earths. So we see resource wars now abounding, and this is already starting to affect the European energy industry. We see secondary tariffs. Under Trump, we're used to primary tariffs on different countries, but secondary tariffs were imposed on Venezuela. And they also look like they're going to be imposed on Iran and Russia. Now, a secondary tariff, if you indirectly or directly buy Venezuelan oil, then President Trump would put between 20 to 30% tariffs on you. For Spain, this was a problem because Spain was the second largest importer of Venezuelan oil for its power stations and businesses and everything else. And all of a sudden, overnight, Spain saw their effective export tariff to the United States go from about 20% to about 50%, which is essentially an embargo. So from an energy industry, from an energy resilience perspective, how many of you thought that secondary tariffs were going to be a thing? And then zero-cost generation. And I'll show you why we're getting close to this. While it still costs capital expenditure to build a solar farm or a wind farm or whatever it happens to be, we can see a point in time where the cost of generating electricity, especially in renewable sources, is almost zero. Now, from a consumption perspective, when you really start digging into it, on the one hand, if we want to improve energy efficiency, using artificial intelligence is a really good way to do that. So Google applied artificial intelligence to their hyperscale data center in Germany, and over a 2-week period, that AI learned everything about the data center. It learned all the energy patterns about that data center. After a 2-week period, it then started optimizing the energy use of all the servers and hardware and infrastructure within that data center. That AI has saved Google 25% of its electricity bill. They're now rolling these kinds of things out across Europe. So when we think about smart systems, smart homes, etc., artificial intelligence is a really, really quick way to help Europe reduce energy consumption. We also see passive air conditioning. So one of the big problems that we see in Asia, as well as Europe and elsewhere around the world, is as the world gets hotter, we rely more and more on air conditioning. So we see air conditioning energy consumption increasing a lot. Over in the United States, we've developed air conditioning that doesn't use any electricity whatsoever. These are passive air conditioning systems. What they do is they take heat out of a building, and using far infrared radiation, they literally beam it into space. So they use the thermal difference between Earth and space to beam excess heat from buildings into space. So we have a way to create air conditioning systems for buildings like this that use zero electricity. What difference would that make when we're having a look at European energy projections? Now, from a consumer perspective, if we look at the next 5 years, and again, trying to get decent statistics, as we learned in the crisis management session earlier, is hard. There's loads of numbers all over the place. Now, from a European consumer consumption perspective, we actually expect, according to sort of Eurostat and Europa and all these other sort of sources, we actually expect European consumers to use less energy in 2050 than they do today. So it's kind of flat, dropping by about 50 terawatt hours. Now, fossil fuels, we expect that in this time frame, we're going to be using 18% less fossil fuel energy sources. But we're obviously going to see a 17% increase in the amount of electricity that households use. So think about electric cars plugging in and so on and so forth. When we think about European industry, energy consumption for European industry broadly looks like it stays flat, but there are some interesting sort of changes. So again, we see a 14% in fossil fuels, so still that sort of 2,500 terawatt hour. However, electricity for heavy industry, so these are steel mills, aluminium mills and everything else, we think basically will increase by 85 terawatt hours. However, when we have a look at hydrogen, hydrogen's kind of a weird one. Now, on the one hand, we do actually have a variety of European heavy industry that is using hydrogen as its energy source. So for example, if you go down to Dow's Tarragona plant down in south of Spain, the Spanish government is investing heavily in hydrogen networks. However, there's a 122% increase in the amount of hydrogen that heavy industry uses because they're also using it as a feedstock for chemicals. So when we have a look at hydrogen, it's not just about using hydrogen to power large chemical industrial plants. It's also about using hydrogen as a feedstock to replace sort of different toxic chemicals and so on and so forth. So this means that we actually see more of a build-out of hydrogen networks across Europe, but from a very low base. When we look at transport, again, we expect that the amount of electricity that transport uses increases substantially. So we see a 180 terawatt increase, or a 58% increase in the amount of electricity that European transportation systems actually use. We estimate 66% of that is going to be electric vehicles. You know, we see that coming through with sales from Volkswagen and so on and so forth, as well as companies like BYD, etc. But 34% of that will be attributed to rail. So European consumer and European industry, in terms of energy consumption, remains flat-ish, but the mix changes. But transport, it ticks up, which we'd expect. Now we have a look at the technology sector. For any of those of you that are familiar with the United States' $500 billion Stargate project, the Stargate data center is estimated to consume, or when it's built, it's estimated it will consume 10 gigawatts of power. That is the equivalent of 10 nuclear power stations. One AI data center, 10 nuclear power stations. When we have a look at OpenAI and Oracle's investment in Abu Dhabi, they're going to be building an artificial intelligence data center that is bigger than Monaco, and it has a 5 gigawatt power draw. So when we actually have a look at the number of AI data centers, especially that are being built around Europe and the rest of the world, in Europe alone, we estimate that we will see a 167% increase in electricity or energy consumption. 50% of that is going to be just really for AI data centers, which is staggering. And in fact, this is such a staggering figure that European governments, as well as American governments, actually are starting to forecast rolling blackouts across Europe if we continue to build out AI data centers at the rate that we are, at the scale that we are. Most AI data centers are about 300 megawatt range. We do see some 2 gigawatt ones coming through. But this is what strains the grid. And in fact, RWE basically say that one of the biggest opportunities they have is data center companies looking to plug into a 300 megawatt or more grid connection. So what happens when we start seeing some of these figures actually coming through into the energy mix? Now, from a business model perspective, this is where new technology combined with new ideas lets us think about new energy-based business models. So this is a gravity battery. So, you know, we think of grid-scale storage systems where we've got lots of lithium-ion battery packs in Bratislava or wherever it happens to be. This is from a company called Energy Vault. So they've been doing a lot of work in Switzerland, actually, which you can go and see. It's quite cool. But one of the thoughts that they've had is the entire skyscraper is a grid-scale storage system. We store energy in the concrete. And then, if you're a generator, you could build one of those, complete with restaurants, hotels, apartments, and so on and so forth. So I'm starting to see quite a number of energy generators, admittedly, now thinking about using this as a business model, where they become property companies. Now, you're going to be kind of familiar with this. This is an electric vehicle. As solar panels get more efficient, we're seeing more companies like Hyundai, Toyota, BMW, Lightyear One, Tesla eventually, putting solar panels on their cars. Now, on the one hand, if you have a car that generates electricity for itself, you don't have to rely on as many lithium-ion batteries. And while we can recycle lithium-ion batteries, this reduces the weight. But that is a small, car-sized energy generation system. Because any extra energy that this car produces can now get transmitted via wireless energy conduction to the cars around them, or to the infrastructure around them. So this is BMW's car. You can charge it wirelessly, and then any extra energy that this car has can then be sold to other cars and other vehicles around it. So BMW suddenly becomes an energy distributor. Hyundai becomes an energy generator. When we think about Tesla, huge amounts of tied grid storage in the battery packs for these things. In Tesla's case, they have a relationship with PG&E in California where Tesla is a virtual power plant. So we aggregate together all of the tied grid storage, basically for all of the electric vehicles. And on the one hand, these actually help boost grid stability. So it's actually estimated that if Europe, for example, used electric vehicles to help stabilize grid stability, that you wouldn't need 30% of the energy generation capacity that we're building out. But then as Tesla starts becoming the virtual power plant company, which they are, they also start entering the energy trading space. So when we think about new business models, we think about traditional nuclear power station, wind turbines, whatever it happens to be. We think about energy business models in a traditional way. But new technologies, new ways of thinking are letting us actually bring new kinds of energy systems into the energy mix. Now, from a future of grids perspective and energy perspective, by 2030, the average age of 50% of the European energy grids is going to be over 40 years old. And if we're replacing these grids at a rate of 3 to 5% per year, that's a huge headache. And we estimate it's going to take about 600 billion euros worth of investment to update the European energy grid. However, even if you had that amount of money, it's a huge problem trying to upgrade these grids. Because overall, we think that by 2030, we're going to see around a 60% increase in the amount of energy that Europe needs. So this is all energy mixes. But the European energy grid is based on 11 million kilometers of cabling, let alone anything else. To replace 11 million kilometers of cabling, that's a humongous engineering feat. And then on top of that, the average amount of time that it takes to get new infrastructure permits and new power plant permits in Europe, this is the average, is 10 years. So if you look at these kind of figures, at what point do we ever have a fully modernized energy system? So technology is accelerating really quickly, new business models are coming in, but even if we had the money, it's a humongous problem to try to actually solve. Now, from a tech perspective, when we have a look at sort of platforms from the likes of General Electric, you can increasingly talk to your wind turbine farm. So when we think about the control systems for a lot of these new developments, you can simply talk to your wind turbine farm and say, how are you doing today? And your wind farm will say, generally I'm doing all right. However, wind turbine number 3 You adjusted the RPM on the wind turbine a little while ago, and it's reduced the usable life of that turbine by 20%. And you sort of say, well, okay, what should we do about that? And these AIs will come back and say, well, I can either adjust the wind turbine RPM for you by applying an AI patch, or you can do it yourself. So increasingly, when we think about all of the interdependencies basically within the grids and the transmission networks and so on and so forth, using some of the latest artificial intelligences, you don't use dashboards, you just simply talk to your infrastructure. And then AI increasingly helps you fix whatever is wrong with that infrastructure. Now, when we think about the energy mix itself, today obviously we are predominantly sort of fossil fuels still, but there's a huge amount of innovation going on. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but when we actually think about things like biofuels, when we have a look at aviation, we're trying to build out huge quantities of sustainable aviation fuel, and generally we think we can manage 1% of all aircraft traffic using SAF. So we simply can't make enough sustainable aviation fuel for the industry. We've got lots of different kind of hydrogen coming through. Renewables, hydro, geo, solar and wind. Then we've got a lot of alternatives to lithium-ion batteries. So when we think about lithium-ion batteries, we've got polymer-based batteries, bacterial batteries, 3D printed lithium-ion batteries. We've got lithium-ion batteries that don't have lithium or cobalt in. We have air-free batteries coming through. A lot of the lithium-ion batteries that are coming through now, or the lithium-ion equivalents that are coming through now, you can charge them in 5 minutes. Really fast charging. You've got ammonia. So if you're looking at cargo ships, for example, increasingly cargo ships are thinking roughly lithium-ion batteries plus ammonia. You've got nuclear. So when I was at COP28, the one thing that people didn't really talk about was the world actually set targets for renewable energy, but actually they wanted to triple the amount of nuclear energy in all of the grids, because nuclear is still seen as a zero-carbon technology. And then structural batteries that we talked about with Lamborghini. But in New Zealand, we've also got wireless energy. So when we talk about grid modernization, one of the biggest problems that New Zealand has is they have lots of mountains. It doesn't make sense economically to start digging huge holes across the mountains to put down cables or transmission lines. So they can now beam multiple kilowatts over a range of about 5 miles. So when we actually have a look at improvements in wireless energy for transmission purposes, there are some interesting things coming through. And then, of course, we've got international grids being connected up and grid-scale storage, etc. But when we think about solar, so one of the things, when we actually have a look, for example, at the European energy mix, the thing that keeps coming through, as we even said this morning, when the sun goes in, solar stops producing electricity. When the wind stops, whatever the German word was, when the wind stops, the wind turbines stop generating electricity. So let's fix it. So most silicon solar panels today are roughly about 23% energy efficient. If you have a Perskovite solar panel, you can create a solar panel that is 32% energy efficient. However, if you put bacteria into a solar panel, you have a solar panel that is 48% energy efficient because we've built it at the US Department of Energy. However, if you put something called carbon nanotubes into a solar panel to reclaim the heat, you have a solar panel that is 80% energy efficient. And then if you use 3D printing to create something called a nanophotonic material, you have a solar panel that's 132% energy efficient. And if you use a quantum material, you have a solar panel that is 190% energy efficient. When I say solar energy is an exponential technology, I mean it. Bearing in mind that at 23% energy efficiency, we're generating electricity at about $20 per megawatt hour. However, if you put graphene onto the top of a solar panel, you generate electricity from snow and rain. If you have bacteria in a solar panel, you generate electricity from moonlight. And if you use new manufacturing processes, you can generate all of the electricity you need from the light in this room. We have the technology now because we've built it to generate solar electricity 24/7, irrespective of whether it's cloudy, raining, snowing, or pitch black. So when we think about grid-scale storage, we can see that as a transition technology. But these take time to scale and so on and so forth. We're seeing deep-sea diesel, so we can use salt water to create what we call green diesel. In Japan, they're putting in deep-sea tidal. So deep-sea tidal is essentially a sort of form of wave system. And these turbines sit on the seabed. Now, Japan believes, after successful trials, that they can generate 260 gigawatts of electricity using deep-sea tidal. And then, of course, basically as wind turbines get bigger, in fact, so big that the problem that we have with wind turbines basically is that the blades are starting to go supersonic. When we have a look at deep-sea turbines, we're now starting to build out deep-sea turbines and turbine wind farms over in the North Sea. And the Chinese are also very good at deep-sea wind turbines. When we look at nuclear reactors, we've got floating nuclear reactors on ships. The advantage of a nuclear reactor on a cargo ship is you can turn up at a port, like Hamburg, and you can plug your nuclear reactor directly into the grid, but you don't need planning permission. So you can just turn up to whatever port you want, plug your nuclear reactor in, and off you go. So we've got mini nuclear reactors that are kind of the size of a truck. In China, they've perfected thorium nuclear reactors that cool themselves without water. And then we've got Bill Gates' favorite, traveling wave nuclear reactors, which actually burn nuclear waste. So we have an estimated $400 billion of nuclear waste around the planet. We can take that and feed that into a TWR reactor. Some of those will be coming to Europe soon. We've got biofuels where we're using synthetic biology to increase the energy density. In Germany, a huge drive on solar fuels. So solar fuels is where we draw hydrocarbons, like carbon dioxide, hydrocarbons, out of the Earth's atmosphere, and we turn those into things like green diesel. So rather than taking diesel and petrol and fossil fuels out of the ground, we simply use catalysts and we use air to create diesel. But it's kind of carbon neutral. The European Union, but also the UK, the US and China, collectively are investing about $50 billion on building solar power stations in space. The Chinese have just approved plans to create a 1 kilometer long array in low Earth orbit that will produce 6 gigawatts of electricity. But the advantage is you can then beam it to anywhere. So if part of the grid goes offline, you just use a mixture of microwave and laser transmission technologies, and you can just spin the satellites. And then when we actually think about grid-scale storage, in France, particularly companies like Carrefour, they're using water. So they're turning water into ice for grid-scale storage. We've got bricks in buildings, carbon dioxide, flow batteries. A flow battery grid-scale storage system is 10% of the cost of a traditional lithium-ion system. And then we've got molten salt from companies like Google, and we've got MIT with plastic. So when we think about grid-scale storage opportunities, it's not just all about lithium-ion batteries. And then finally, from a security perspective, I told you basically that you wouldn't like this. 8 months ago in the UK, we used ChatGPT, specifically GPT-4. We used AI agents to chain together zero-day exploits. These autonomous cyber weapons hacked through all of the military-grade systems that we were put in front of them, and they hacked through those systems in 2 minutes. So artificial intelligence can now create and design its own cyber weapons systems, whether that's ransomware and malware, phishing, all that kind of stuff. But increasingly, cyber attacks against the European energy grid will be not just autonomous, but these systems will start making cyber weapons in real time to hammer through whatever your system is. This is a problem. What happens when critical national infrastructure goes from being hit by billions of different cyber attacks a day to constant attacks that are evolving, that are being built as these AI systems deem fit? In the United States government didn't really believe that the Chinese government had pre-positioned any malware or any cyber weapons systems in American critical national infrastructure. We thought the same in Europe as well. However, about a year ago, we discovered something called Volt Typhoon. So Volt Typhoon basically is a kit of cyber weapons systems that have been pre-positioned in power plants, in transmission networks, in anything and everything that is critical national infrastructure. And the idea behind Volt Typhoon is that in the event of a conflict, you just turn the European energy grid off. You literally just go, but you can't restart it. Now, when we start thinking about artificial intelligence, the AIs that you're using today, especially the neural networks that you're using today, have more in common with human behavior and human psychology. We can hack some of the largest, most sophisticated large language models using human psychology. They do insider trading, they blackmail people, they deceive, they lie, etc. Now, on the one hand, we can poison the data that you're using to train your own artificial intelligences so that I can change the AI's behavior, and or I can put a backdoor in, and once I have a backdoor into all of your systems, I can shut you down. I can delete your AIs if I want to, bearing in mind that increasingly AI is running the operating layer. So if we have Chinese malware inserted in critical national infrastructure, at what point do we see AI weapons systems being embedded within artificial intelligence models themselves? I guarantee there is not a single client that you talk to that has thought of that. When we think about manufacturing, so one of the problems that RWE has faced is they buy a lot of wind turbines from Siemens, for example, but Siemens, as it turns out, buys a lot of their parts from China. And recently, again in America, we found a lot of new interesting technologies in Chinese solar panels. So increasingly, from a government perspective, most governments are now starting to say, energy security is our priority. The cyber resilience of our infrastructure is critical, and therefore you can't use Chinese computer chips, Chinese hardware, Chinese technology in different parts of the energy makeup. So The Chinese government has something called the Little Giants program. It's around 3,000 small companies that are never ever designed to be big. But they are all designed to, in the CCP's words, burrow into global supply chains. So if you're buying a wind turbine that's been manufactured in Europe, if any sanctions are applied to China, then they will just simply say, well, we're not supplying you with the rare earths, we're not supplying you with the computer chips that you need for your wind turbines. So increasingly, we are seeing a variety of rather interesting security threats actually being embedded directly into the transmission, the UHVDC systems, as well as wind turbines, solar panels, critical national infrastructure, nuclear power plants as well. So supply chain risk is increasing exponentially. And then earlier, basically, we talked about some of the interconnects. So when we actually have a look at the North Sea energy island, we have a huge number of interconnects, basically connecting that to the UK, to Germany, basically to all sorts of places. Increasingly, the number of acts of sabotage against energy interconnects, especially by sort of Russia and so on and so forth, is increased. And, if we have a look at just some of the European interconnects, in Turkey, there's 12,000 kilometers of cable. So when we start thinking about all of these different things, on the one hand, there's a huge amount of opportunity to rapidly transform the European energy landscape. But there's also a huge amount of threats that are present, which makes what you do, the seats that you're sitting in, even more vital. There were far too many people, as we saw with the French and Spanish blackouts, that took electricity or energy, but electricity for granted. If you do not have energy, you do not have a modern society. Your water treatment systems stop. Your hospitals stop. Your smartphones eventually die. So from a preparation perspective, this is what, and I see these problems basically with every company I work with. Speed of change is a problem. Increasing complexity is a problem. So how do we deal with this? So firstly, stretch your horizon view. Don't look at just what's coming today. Look at what's coming in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Because if everything is speeding up, the stuff that would have come in 15 years' time is coming faster. Stretch your view, which is sort of what we're doing today. And then ask yourself, what shifts are inevitable? Yes, we might see new policies and everything else, but the general direction of travel for Europe, for example, is net zero and renewable energy. So we know the direction of travel. We don't necessarily know what power plants are going to be built where, et cetera, but we know the general direction of travel is there. When we have a look at energy security, we know that energy security is going to be important today, but also in the next 10, 20, 30 years. We know that risk is going to increase in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And then once you understand what is inevitable, you need to align. So you align yourselves with the future. This is how you start preparing yourself. We know that AI is going to play much more of a role, basically, in the energy ecosystem than before. So align with AI. The what and the how and the who, that's the details. But you need to align culture and leadership. Increasingly, as an organization, you need to be able to move at speed because you're in a changing environment that's changing at speed, different speeds. And then how do you align new capabilities? Capabilities very much, well, if the future looks like it's going to be this, these are the capabilities that we need. And that's it. So when we think about energy, when we go to turn the lights on and they just turn on, remember that you're turning on an artificial sun. But also, realize just how much change the industry is actually going through. And you're central to that change. So the future is not boring. The future is very exciting. It's confusing. It's challenging. It's all these kinds of things. But if you like a challenge, there's definitely some challenges coming up. So thank you very much for your time.